Hello, thrilling suspense fantasy listeners, readers, aficionados. This next story is set in the marvelous Clark Ashton Smith setting of Averoigne. I picked up an anthology called the Averoigne Legacy, edited by Edward Stasheff, tribute tales in the world of Clark Ashton Smith. And when I read this particular story, called Hugh the Discerning by Garnett, Elliot, I knew I had to bring it to you. I knew I had to come back and deliver this to you. So without further ado, let's get started with Hugh the Discerning by Garnett, Elliot. One warm spring morning, the Reeve Hugh de Manchefort was out among his gardens supervising the early planting. Amidst flowering chamomile and carefully cropped bushes of amaranth, delphinium, and juniper, he stood like a stern warden, an elderly man in a woolen shirt and a broad-brimmed hat, with a long willow rod tucked beneath one arm. If a servant went about his duties without sufficient zest, then whack, out came the willow rod across the unfortunate's back. Such was Hugh's devotion to detail that he inspected each and every seed before it was placed beneath the ground. His garden had not suffered for his attentions. A lush checkerboard of rare plants, stately trees, and polished, artfully placed stones. Everything seemed to prosper beneath Hugh's watchful eye. Presently he noticed an assortment of villagers heading up the road towards his estate. A single gray-haired figure marched purposefully at the lead. Hugh squinted his eyes in recognition and frowned. The procession drew close. The leadmost figure was none other than Matron Margiot, a woman of property nearly as old as Hugh, and no small authority in the village of Wherein. She wore a coat of green velvet, and had her hair drawn up with long silver pins brought from Troyes. Hugh bluntly asked the nature of her business. "You have not heard the news?" she asked. Hugh scratched at the scalp just beneath the rim of his hat. "What news are you referring to?" "Why, the ogre Chantillion, of course," she said, looking surprised. "Ogre?" Hugh said slowly. "Yes, even now he ravages the forests around Wherein. It is only a matter of time before he enters the village proper." Hugh stared at Matron Margiot and the crowd behind her for several long moments. He then turned to one of his servants and began instructing him in the proper trimming of rhododendrons. Sensing dismissal, Margiot stepped forward and rapped her knuckles against the front gate. "Hugh," she demanded, "Hugh, I am not finished speaking to you." Hugh looked up wearily from his flower bush. "Yes?" "I was telling you about the ogre Chantillion, and how he threatens the common good of Wherein." "Yes, a frightful character, I'm sure." Hugh bent to examine a clipping. "And you, along with half of the village here, have brought this to my attention because—" "You are the Reeve." "Yes," Hugh admitted, "I am the Reeve. That means I count grain. I am responsible for keeping an accurate tally for the Comte de Fleuris. I am not, however, responsible for vague supernatural threats." Softly, Margiot said, "You are also Hugh the Discerning." Hugh straightened. At the mention of his old sobriquet, some of the harshness drained from his face. "You have a long memory," he said, but his tone was not so dismissive now. Hugh had long ago earned a reputation for his powers of perception. When presented with several choices, it was said, Hugh could unerringly pick the best, and this had helped to build his early successful career, serving in courts as far away as Venice and Prague. Even to the present, he enjoyed the best livestock, carefully culled and bred from the farms of his neighbors. He employed the best vintner and ale tasters in the region, so that his private stocks were always sought after, and he had procured for himself, after much haggling, the most handsome, vivacious young wife that a man of his advanced age and station could hope for. "I'm flattered," Hugh said carefully, that you have sought my counsel in this important matter. I would advise you thusly. Take your appeal to the Comte de Fleuris. He can dispatch some of his horsemen to help out, provided you can convince him of the threat posed by this creature. Matron Margiot shook her head. Your mind is no doubt clouded by your exertions this morning, else you would remember that the Comte's horsemen are away raiding our neighbors in Cour-sur-Mer at the behest of our benevolent lordship. Then I would exhort you to locate the Christian hero Balthazar of Messina, a swordsman without equal, who bears the magic blade Triste. He should prove more than adequate in dispatching your ogre. Again, said Matron Margiot, more tersely this time, I think the vapors of this fresh morning air have left you addled, else you would recall that Balthazar is now a prisoner of the Moors, and the sword Triste is believed to languish in some Saracen treasure-house masterless. Hugh reddened. The duties of my station, he said thickly, do not allow me time for idle gossip about faraway places. You have come here seeking my aid, and I have given it. For all I know, you are having some elaborate joke at my expense, teasing me with this fairy talk about ogres and what-not. Chantilly is real, came a voice from among the villagers. The crowd parted, allowing a shepherd to come hobbling forward, leaning heavily against his crook. His face was youthful and unlined. He had a trace of blonde stubble growing at his chin, but his eyes and his mannerisms were those of a much older man. Hugh noticed with a start that his left leg was gone below the knee. I have met Chantilly myself, the shepherd said. I can vouch for his cruelty. Go on, said Hugh. Margiot leaned close and draped a comforting hand over the young shepherd. He began to talk, haltingly at first, of how Chantilly had come across his cottage in the dead of night and Grendel-like stole inside to devour his family while still in their beds. The shepherd had awakened and tried to escape by leaping out a window, but Chantilly caught his leg before he was all the way through and held him fast. Relishing his own cleverness, the ogre then began to explain how he had found him. He came across my son, the shepherd said, while he was out grazing the flock, killed him and ate him on the spot. Tears slid down his cheek and onto the fine velvet of Margiot's dress. Then he ate every sheep one by one until only our old hound was left. Chantilly made as if to let him go, but then followed at a distance. The dog led him all the way back to our house. I feared for my life, maddened by grief as I was, but Chantilly's hunger must have been sated from his night's work. He let me escape. As I fell out of the window, he gave my leg one final grasp and tore with all his strength, lest I ever forget what had happened. The shepherd fell silent. Margiot began to help him hobble backwards towards the crowd, but he turned suddenly and fixed his eyes upon Hugh. I have glimpsed Chantilly's house in the darkest corner of the wood, he said. Built from the bones, skin, and sinew of his victims, a grue house, and it grows larger as the ogre ranges farther about the forest. Soon he will come to the edge of moraine. Hugh gravely shook his head. I believe you, but, as Matron Margiot has already pointed out, my counsel is lacking. I do not know what to do. You could take action, Margiot said. I have seen an old sword hanging above your mantelpiece in the main hall. That sword belonged to my father, good lady. I do not have the skill to use it, or the strength, for that matter. Margiot looked down at her feet. The crowd shifted, trading uneasy glances and muttering, but no one raised their voice to speak. I will pledge this, Hugh said quickly, sensing the need for authority. Tomorrow I will have the sword taken down and brought to the square. Assemble those stalwarts among the villagers brave enough to face this threat, preferably young ones. I will choose the fittest candidate from among these and bestow upon him the weapon. The crowd made no response. Geese honked from the wicker cages nearby. A lark circled overhead. Margiot, still sullen, nodded her head and turned away from the gate. The villagers silently trailed after her. They marched back up the road with far less enthusiasm as when they had come down it. Hugh noticed all his servants were staring at him. "Back to work," he sputtered, laying about with the willow rod until they were again kneeling and digging. He tried to concentrate on the garden, but the feeling he had shirked his obligations nagged him for the rest of the morning. At noon he found a large mound in his turnip bed swarming with ants. He watched the creatures for the better part of an hour until he felt he had identified certain ants that were behaving in a laggardly manner and carefully ground those beneath his heel. In this fashion he convinced himself he had helped Moraine by ridding it of inefficient elements, and was so able to free his conscience for the rest of the day. The next morning Hugh had a servant take down the old sword and wrap it in oilcloth, which he carried himself to the village square. Margit was already there and waiting. She had dressed somberly for the occasion, dark blue velvet instead of her usual green lapis earrings, and a shawl of black silk. Her entourage sat patiently around the brick perimeter of the square, now more spectators than concerned citizens. 3 men, presumably the candidates, stood behind her. Hugh surveyed them quickly and frowned. He asked Margit when the rest would arrive. "We asked among the villagers, as you prescribed," she said. "These were the only willing to come forward. But they're all... He wrung his hands in disbelief. Margit shrugged. "We have what we have. Begin your judging." Hesitant, hugging the sword bundle against his chest, Hugh walked over to the first candidate, a young man of disheveled appearance. One of his eyes stared off at a pronounced angle from the other. Hugh asked him a question, and he answered with a stream of amiable babble. "I recognize this man," Hugh said at last, "as Gerard the Idiot. He is a stable hand at the farm of Guillaume Sévère." "It's true," admitted Margit. "And did he volunteer for this duty of his own free will?" "I am not completely sure. He is difficult to understand. Suffice to say that I put the question to him, and he seemed agreeable enough." "I see." Hugh moved on to the next candidate. This was a much older man, around Hugh's own age, with great shaggy mats of silver hair. He sat cross-legged on the ground. He was clothed in old rags clotted with urine and ale, and a stench wafted up from him with the force of a stiff breeze. "This is Antoine Delou," Hugh said with disgust, clutching at his nostrils. "A known drunkard and layabout." "True," confessed Matron Margit, "but it is common knowledge that the spirits can embolden a man and fire his heart to great deeds." Hugh gave her a despairing look. "And so," he said, addressing Antoine, "how would a tosspot such as yourself hope to overcome Chantillion? I don't think you have the wits about you to find your way out of the square." In reply, Antoine vomited up a stream of thick brown liquid. Hugh could not dash aside in time to avoid having his boots splashed. He fumed and kicked at the besotted man before turning to the final candidate. This last was more promising than the previous 2, and Hugh felt his hopes soar for a brief moment. He was a young man with intelligent features and wore his long black hair tied back in a poet's queue. His eyes were reddened and sore. When Hugh approached, he buried his face in his hands and began to sob. "And what is wrong with this one?" Hugh asked, suddenly weary. "Ask him yourself. It is a sad story, and frankly makes me depressed to repeat it." The young man composed himself and told his story. He was indeed a poet, and very much in love with a certain young Colette, whom he had courted for the better part of a year with the intention of marriage. But at the last moment she had spurned him for an older, wealthier prospect. "This story has a familiar ring to it," observed Hugh. "I assume you wish to win Colette back by the performance of heroic deeds." The poet threw up his hands. "What does it matter?" he asked, his eyes becoming wide and manic, his ink-stained fingers trembling. "Colette has already been married, and nothing I do can bring her back." He leaned close to Hugh and looked at him slyly. "In truth," he giggled, I only wanted to obtain the sword so that I could run myself through at the first opportunity." Then he collapsed to the floor and began weeping all over again. Hugh cursed aloud, but Matron Margiot could only profess her own frustration. The only men willing to come forward, she concluded, were those who already had nothing to lose. "I find not one of them suitable," Hugh said. He turned back to the crowd, huddling around the edges of the square, speaking loud enough so everyone could hear. "I see no other recourse," he said. "As a group, we must arm ourselves with torches and pitchforks, if nothing else is available, and seek out Chantillion in the surrounding woods. I doubt that even this creature could prevail against a mob. There would, of course, be casualties." His voice trailed off. Most of the spectators were rapidly leaving the square. "What is this?" Hugh said, turning to Margiot. "Your army appears to be deserting the field." Hugh sighed. "Yesterday they seemed much more resolute." "They're scared," Margiot said simply. "They've had no training as soldiers." "And I have?" Margiot ignored this question. A small, determined-looking group of villagers remained behind, including the one-legged shepherd, but they were not numerous enough to form a mob. Hugh shook his head in disgust. He began to stalk away from the square. "And where do you think you're going?" Margiot demanded. "Home. If the townsfolk are too craven to band together for their own good, then so be it. I go to arrange the defenses of my own estate." "But your pledge—" "I have done as I pledged." The young shepherd's staff struck against the floor with such force that fragments of brick flew upwards, and the sound echoed through the square like a thunderclap. All eyes now turned to him. "You pledged," he said, leveling the crook at Hugh, "to choose among the candidates and pick the most suitable. None of them are suitable. By default, you are the most fit to confront Chantillion." "That's not what I meant," Hugh snapped. "What kind of logic is this?" The crowd began to murmur. Margiot looked from them and back at Hugh, blinking rapidly, but just then a red-haired plowboy stepped forward and everyone fell silent again. The plowboy respectfully cleared his throat. "I have always heard," he said, "that ogres are stupid creatures and easily tricked." Hugh nodded towards the shepherd. "He found his home cleverly enough." "Yes," said Margiot, warming to the idea, "this Chantillion may possess some base cunning, but what is this next to the brains of Hugh the Discerning? You doubt if you can use a sword. I say that your sharp tongue is a sword, and your quick wits a shield. With these weapons you could surely overcome a simple backwoods ogre." "You are proposing that I somehow trick this ogre?" Hugh asked. Again, Margiot's mention of his old title had restored some pride, stoking a fire within Hugh's belly, albeit a small one. "Yes." She looked thoughtful for a moment. "Perhaps you could lure Chantillion off a cliff." "Or into a fast-moving river," suggested somebody else. The group was quick to paint other similarly inane scenarios, all involving a high degree of culpability on the part of the ogre. The one-legged shepherd did not seem as confident as the others in this matter, but he was not about to break the group's momentum. "I doubt if the creature is that stupid," Hugh said, at last, "but I think the idea has merit." Margaret brightened. "Then you'll go?" Hugh set his finger to the edge of his chin. Pride was like strong drink to him, and now the fire in his stomach was a furnace blazing stronger still. In the courts of Milan, in Provence, he had faced poisoners and assassins' knives, the consequences of 100 ill-fated intrigues, and yet his agile mind had always seen him through. Was he so rusted now, after years of grain counting and livestock whelping, that he could not reclaim the hard-won lauds of his youth? He steeled himself by blotting out the possibility of failure. "I will try," he said softly. The small crowd let out a cheer and rushed forward to mill about Hugh. Matron Margit kissed him on both cheeks. He absorbed what adulation he felt appropriate, then waved the group back. The morning was still young, and, if he hurried, he would have several hours of daylight to search for Chantilly in the woods nearby. He sent a message to his wife that he would be home by evening, then left the square via the main road, treading his way out of town and past the boundaries of Moraine proper. For half an hour he walked until the tall Averoignian forest of beech and poplar loomed close. He left the road and took an old trail used by poachers, leading into the thickest parts of the wood. He was in good spirits. Grass and flowering brush reached to waist height on either side of the trail. Insects droned, and in the high branches above, jackdaws called challenge to one another. The sword bundle was becoming increasingly heavy, so in annoyance he cast it into the woods. Perhaps he would be able to find it on his way back, perhaps not. He needed something new to go over the mantelpiece anyway. By late afternoon the shadows were growing longer and the trail nearing its end, but Hugh still had not found Chantilly or his grue house. He would need to turn back soon, before darkness overtook the woods completely. Tomorrow he could find another trail and begin the search anew, all the better as he had failed to come up with a clever plan on how to trick the ogre once he had found him. He would have to think on that during supper. Hugh turned to leave and stopped. Somewhere off to his left came a sound low and rhythmic like hammer blows. He strained his ears. The sound was not far away. He stepped off the trail, plunging past brush and low-lying branches. Cracks of sunlight appeared through the foliage ahead, and suddenly he was free, standing at the edge of a bright clearing. 50 paces away he glimpsed the source of the strange noise. A tall woodsman was carefully lining up white posts and driving them into the ground with a cudgel. Behind him, in the shadows of the tree line, he could dimly see the woodsman's modest estate. Hugh's immediate thoughts were of rest and refreshment. Perhaps he could stay the night, and, with directions, resume his search for Chantilly in the morning, without having to walk all the way back to Moraine. He called out, and the woodsman waved back, amiably enough. He set out across the clearing. At 20 paces, Hugh began to realize something was wrong. The woodsman, in proportion to the surrounding trees and brush, seemed disconcertingly large. His hands and forearms were grossly knotted with muscle. Although he stooped at his work, and his face was therefore difficult to see, when the woodsman turned to fetch a fresh post, Hugh was presented with a strange, craggy profile. At 10 paces, more details. The woodsman wore a great coat stitched together from bear skins, odd pieces of cloth, and oily leathers. An enormous hat of red felt tried to encompass his head, and over his back, dropping just below the waist, draped someone's tablecloth. Beneath the brim of the hat, Hugh could see rows of shovel-like teeth set within a square jaw, and a long nose with 3 long hairs protruding from the tip, 1 golden, 1 black, and 1 green. A sudden and uncomfortable thought occurred to Hugh, but then it was too late. The woodsman stood up to his full height, grinning fiercely, and extended a massive hand. "Good evening," he said in a low but dulcet tone. Hugh could now see that the posts he had been hammering were human femurs. A thick odor, sweet and strangely familiar, wafted over from the direction of the cottage. Hugh declined to shake his hand. "Are you the woodsman in these parts?" he asked. "I am Chantilly," the creature replied, removing any doubts. Hugh swallowed. "I am Hugh de Manchefort, from the village of Moraine." "Hugh de Manchefort?" Chantilly pulled at his protruding lower lip. "The name rings familiar. May I ask what you are doing in the middle of these woods?" The bright morning, with its confident talk about clever tricks and stupid ogres, seemed a long time off. Hugh could not think of a properly guileful response. "I will not mince words," he said at last. "I have come in defense of my village, whose inhabitants you have been molesting. I am charged with the task of ridding you from these parts." Chantillion nodded, half smirking as he drummed his fingers against his chin. "I admire your frankness. Sadly, I am committed to staying here for the present time." "Then we are at an impasse." "It would appear so." An awkward silence ensued. Then Chantillion began to laugh softly. "We could at least try to be civil," he said. He pointed with a muscular arm towards the cottage, presumably his brew house. "The temperature will be getting nippy soon. I suggest we retire inside and discuss the matter further." Hugh agreed. If the ogre desired to overpower him, he could easily do so whether they were indoors or out. More importantly, Chantillion appeared to be a rational, even reasonable creature, and Hugh's skill at diplomacy might prevail where his trickery could not. Chantillion led him up a twisting walkway past piles of innumerable bones to a cottage that was not really a solid structure at all, but a giant tent made from carefully flayed and preserved human skins. Such was Chantillion's skill that Hugh could still make out individual faces within the canvas, and personal details like moles, birthmarks, and scars seemed to have been emphasized rather than blended away. Bones wrapped tight with corded sinew provided support. The smell was nearly overpowering, and thick clouds of black flies hovered above the roof. "It's not altogether finished," Chantillion admitted, as he undid the finger-bone prongs that held the front flap shut. "Right this way." Inside, the air was warm and moist. The walls a dim pink shot through with purple veins, and Hugh was struck uncomfortably with the sensation of being inside a giant's stomach. Chantillion led him through a series of chambers, all apparently kitchens by virtue of their cooking pots, racks of sharp knives and saws, and haunches of unidentifiable meats hanging from the ceiling. He at last entered a spacious central room and was offered a seat made from some unfortunate's pelvis. "An idea is coming to me," Chantillion said, after Hugh had been seated. "A way, perhaps, to resolve our mutual dilemma." "Please make it known. I myself have no solid plans along this line." Chantillion looked at him closely. "I said before that your name sounded familiar. In truth, it is your other name that I remember more clearly." Hugh was taken aback. "But how do you know?" "I have traveled this country extensively. Once, in the wastelands outside Pont du Plénier, I befriended a certain Benedictine monk who regaled me with local legends before we parted ways. One of these legends was you." "Go on." "I mean no disrespect, but I find it hard to credit some of the wilder claims made about your powers of perception." Hugh smiled inwardly. Was the ogre proposing a challenge, and against his strongest suit? If so, then Chantillion was playing right into his hands, and Hugh had not even bothered to set a trap. "I think I see where this is going," Hugh said, "and I would be happy to satisfy your curiosity. Simply name your terms." Chantillion leaned forward in earnest. "I propose this. I will present you with 3 unknown objects, and ask that you discern their true natures." "Is that it?" Hugh asked, stifling a laugh. "I have played thousands of such guessing games in courts all over the continent. To accept your challenge would hardly be in good sport." "In that case, I would propose instituting a handicap, say a blindfold." "I would insist on a blindfold at least," Hugh said, feeling magnanimous. "And if this does not prove difficult enough, you may propose further handicaps as the challenge unfolds." "Such confidence!" Chantillion exclaimed. "Such generosity, even before the match has begun." He looked at Hugh sideways for a moment, then asked slowly, "You don't intend to trick Chantillion, do you? That would be a cruelty indeed. I remind you that I am a rustic, a provincial, and not given to the worldly complications of a man who has served in court." "You have my word that I will ply no such trickery," Hugh said. In his opinion, the ogre seemed quite adept at tricking himself. And yet, Hugh's vaunted perception had already failed him. He had overlooked several clues pointing to the cerebral refinements of his host. On a nearby table rested a set of Plato's Dialogues, along with a complete copy of the Republic, both lovingly bound in human skin and dog-eared after much perusal. There were miniature chess sets carved from baby's teeth, a half-finished astrolabe, and a series of anatomy portfolios penned in Arabic and Italian. Chantillion was an intellectual, but Hugh's senses, distracted by the gory opulence of the Grew house, were drawn elsewhere, and he could only see the ogre as the rustic he claimed himself to be. "We have an agreement, then," Chantillion said. "If you can discern all three subjects, I will leave Moraine peaceably." "And if I lose?" Chantillion smiled. "There are certain sections of the house needing expansion." Hugh silently reassured himself. Chantillion produced a blood-stained rag and carefully wound this rag around Hugh's eyes, making sure they were wholly covered. When he had finished, Hugh testified that he could not see a thing. "Does the room seem a tad chill to you?" the ogre asked, as he was bringing forth the first object for discernment. "Somewhat. I am not averse to a fire, if that is your intention." There was a brief moment as Chantillion stoked the requisite fire, then he placed something spherical and vaguely wet in Hugh's outstretched hands. Hugh stroked the convoluted surface, brought it close to sniff, and took a small bite. "Ha!" he exclaimed. "Cabbage! I would say it is 3 days past its prime. Still all right for putting in soup, though." He nibbled further. "I suspect that it was stolen from a farm near here." "Guillaume Severt's? Yes. And from the dew still on the leaves, the cabbage was stolen in the dead of night, in great haste, so as to avoid Severt's many hounds." Chantillion gasped. "You have described both the cabbage and the conditions of its abduction to the letter." "As I surmised," Hugh said, quite pleased with himself. "I would suggest you impose another handicap before we go any further." "A good idea. Let me ponder this." Hugh heard Chantillion pouring a large quantity of water. "Would you like some tea? I usually take a cup or two around this time." Hugh politely declined. Chantillion drew close, then gently bound Hugh's hands behind his back with a length of knotted rope. "I have decided that your hands are too clever," he said when he was finished. "Let us see if you can discern the next item so quickly." Hugh felt a small object drop into his lap. Without the use of his hands it was indeed difficult to ascertain more, but he moved his hips in such a way that the object rolled onto his knee, and from there he was able to bend down and seize it with his teeth. Almost instantly he knew what it was. "This is a turnip fresh from the soil." By a combination of taste and smell, he was able to describe to the ogre the pedigree of the turnip to the same exacting quality as he had the cabbage. Again, Chantillion was dutifully impressed. "I must warn you," Hugh said, "that your predilection towards vegetables is making this much easier than I anticipated, despite the handicaps." I see your point. A change in environment. Perhaps if you were disoriented this time." Hugh felt himself being hauled up bodily and carried a short distance. The next moment he was plunged neck-deep into tepid water. He called out, sputtering protest against the nature of this handicap. Chantillion promptly removed the blindfold. Hugh was immersed in the waters of a giant cauldron. Cabbages, turnips, and a dozen different kinds of wild mushrooms all bobbed in the waters around him. Chantillyon's mouth parted in a huge smile. "What is this?" Hugh asked, outraged. He couldn't climb out of the cauldron as both of his hands were still bound. "Why, I would think that obvious to someone as perceptive as yourself." Hugh's eyes went wide. "But the rules of our contest! You have yet to bring forth the third object, and therefore I have not lost." "Well," replied Chantillion, "I have not yet thought of a third object to present. I suspect, however, that you will be thoroughly boiled by the time I do." "Cheater!" Hugh snarled. "Base trickster!" "Tut, tut! Let's not make an unpleasant situation any worse." Chantillion turned his back and began preparing various implements. The water was heating rapidly, and already Hugh's skin was turning bright pink. He pleaded with Chantillion to be spared, offering him his estate, his young wife, and sums of money he did not have. "I am moved to a small amount of sympathy," Chantillion said at last. "Not enough to free you, of course." He produced a tray of fresh-cut shallots and proffered them to Hugh. "You may exercise your gifts for a final time." Somberly, but with an air of dignity, Hugh sorted among the shallots for those that would make the most tasty addition to the stew. A week passed in the village of Wherein. When Hugh did not return from the woods, the townsfolk suspected the worst, and dutifully went about electing a new reeve. Panic around the approach of Chantillion reached a fever pitch, and then subsided when sightings of the ogre began to decline. As hot summer swiftly overtook the spring, travelers through the woods reported a fearsome stench, almost overwhelming, emanating from a certain clearing, and great clouds of flies and carrion birds darkened the sky. Chantillion appeared at the edge of Wherein a short time later. He wasted no time, moving himself swiftly into Hugh's old estate. Hugh's former servants and closest neighbors fled immediately, with the notable exception of his young widow. Nothing else untoward occurred for several weeks. Matron Margiot, concerned as ever for public safety, sent an official petition for aid to the Comte de Fleuris and was promptly ignored. Soon afterwards, Hugh's widow was seen making daily sojourns to the market and buying enormous amounts of food, mostly meat, but to the most fervent questions regarding her well-being would only make casual replies. In fact, she was often spotted in public singing idly or weaving wildflowers into her long hair. When pressed idly as to why she did not mourn the passing of her gentle old husband, only to have him replaced by a large and no doubt rapacious ogre, she would only smile broadly. The matter became the subject of much disreputable speculation. Later that fall, a rooster belonging to Guillaume Severtz laid a reddish-hued egg from which hatched a strange worm. Severtz cut the unwholesome creature into bits and threw the remains into his hay-pile, but the worm soon reformed and grew to prodigious size. The creature destroyed Severt's barn and began devouring all the sheep and cattle in the surrounding area. The villagers were once again in disarray about what to do. Finally, Matron Margiot grew desperate and appealed to the powerfully built Chantillion for help. The ogre pledged his support on the spot. Near Severt's farm, he uprooted a beech tree and affixed an old plowshare to one end. With his giant axe, he chopped the worm into several quivering pieces, which he swiftly collected and threw into a roaring fire. The worm was completely consumed. From that point on, the terror surrounding Chantillion's presence in Wherein subsided into a general uneasiness, and he was hailed as a local champion, albeit from a discreet distance. Like Hugh the Discerning before him, Chantillion became known for his wise temperament. Unlike Hugh, he proved to be a man of action, and not given to the vagaries of thought that often paralyze otherwise capable people. He would on occasion break into old form and make off with neighbors' livestock, but the townsfolk agreed, Matry and Margiot foremost, that this was a small price to pay for having an ogre in the village. The end. Long-time listeners, fans, people who have been with me on this thrilling suspense fantasy journey will know that Clark Ashton Smith holds a special place in my estimation of the great pulp fantasy writers, and this tale, with its ironic flavor and dark humor, I believe very much captures the vibe that makes Clark Ashton Smith so fantastic. The tension, the building trick that Chantillion plays on Hugh, I believe is beautifully executed. If I were to offer Garnett one criticism, it would be that his use of language is less luxurious than that of Clark Ashton Smith, but perhaps he does this to make it more readable. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and do check out the links below in the video description if you would like to get your hands on some thrilling suspense fantasy. At this point, I'm nearly all the way through Volume 3 and have not put up the Kickstarter, but you probably need Volumes 1 and 2. Anyways, subscribe, like, comment, make a request. I will talk to you next time.